For nearly half a century, the mere whisper of a single word was enough to freeze the blood of any man, woman, or child in Central Europe. That word was Tatar. It brought with it the memory of smoke, of cities turned to ash, and of a speed and violence so incomprehensible that it seemed supernatural. The Mongol Empire, the greatest land empire history had ever known, was not just an army, it was a force of nature, a scourge of God sent to punish the sins of Christendom. In the year 1241, the Mongols had swept through Poland like a scythe through dry wheat. They had annihilated the Polish knighthood at the Battle of Legnica. They had placed the head of the High Duke on a spear and paraded it before the terrified survivors. They had proven, decisively and brutally, that the heavy, static warfare of feudal Europe was no match for the lightning-fast, coordinated fury of the steppe horsemen. For decades, Poland lived in the long, dark shadow of that defeat. The psychological scar was profound. The lesson seemed to be that resistance was futile, that when the thundering hooves returned, the only options were flight or death. But history is rarely a straight line, and the wheel of fortune turns in unexpected ways. 46 years after that initial catastrophe, the Golden Horde turned its gaze westward once again. The year was 1287. The Khans, Tulabuga, and the legendary Nogai gathered a massive host, numbering 30,000 seasoned warriors. They expected a repeat of the past. They expected panic. They expected a fragmented, squabbling nobility that would crumble at the first volley of arrows. They expected to fill their saddlebags with gold and drive columns of slaves back to the Volga. But this time, when the Golden Horde crossed the Vistula, they did not find the Poland of 1241. They walked into a trap half a century in the making. They found a kingdom that had learned the hardest lessons imaginable. This is the story of the invasion that broke the myth of Mongol invincibility in the West. This is the story of how a victimized nation transformed itself into a fortress, and how the hunters became the hunted. To understand the shock of 1288, we must first understand the depth of the trauma that preceded it. The Mongol war machine was an entity of terrifying efficiency. In previous decades, European knights, encased in heavy mail and adhering to a code of chivalry that valued individual combat, were utterly baffled by Mongol tactics. The Mongols did not fight for glory, they fought to win. They used feigned retreats to lure arrogant knights into ambushes. They used smoke signals and flags to coordinate movements across miles of battlefield instantly. Their composite bows could punch through armor at distances that rendered European crossbows and javelins useless. When they struck Poland in 1241 and again in 1259, they treated the land not as a territory to be conquered, but as a hunting ground. The invasion of 1259 had been particularly humiliating. It was a raid of pure extraction. The Mongols ravaged the countryside, sacked the major cities of Sandomierz and Krakow, and left with so much loot and so many captives that the demographic devastation took generations to repair. In the eyes of the Mongol commanders, Poland was a soft target, a reliable bank they could withdraw from whenever the Golden Horde needed resources or political prestige. By the late 1280s, the Golden Horde was experiencing its own internal shifts. The empire was vast, and political rivalries simmered between the erratic Khan Tulabuga and the cunning, powerful warlord Nogai Khan. Nogai was a kingmaker, a veteran of wars from the Danube to the Caucasus. To cement their authority and perhaps to outdo one another in martial glory, they agreed on a massive joint expedition against Poland. The plan was a classic pincer movement. Tulabuga would take the northern route, striking towards the Sandomierz region, while Nogai would sweep south towards Krakow. It was a strategy designed to divide the Polish defense, forcing them to scramble in two directions at once, leaving them vulnerable to being crushed in detail. It was winter. The Mongols preferred winter invasions in Russia and Eastern Europe for a simple, tactical reason: frozen rivers. The Vistula, the San, and the Dunajec were not barriers in December. They were highways of ice that allowed their cavalry to move with terrifying speed. As the snow began to fall in late 1287, the scouts of the Golden Horde crossed the frontier. They moved with the confidence of men who had never known defeat in this land. However, the Poland they entered was under the stewardship of a man who had spent his life preparing for this moment. Leszek the Black, the High Duke of Poland, was a ruler of complex character. Often maligned by chroniclers for his struggles with the nobility and the church, he possessed a keen military mind. He understood that Poland could not defeat the Mongols in an open field. To meet the Golden Horde on a flat plain was suicide, Their mobility was simply too great. If Poland was to survive, it had to change the geometry of the war. In the years following the earlier devastations, a quiet revolution had taken place across the Polish landscape. It was a revolution of stone. In 1241, most Polish fortifications were made of wood and earth. A wooden palisade could be burned, smashed, or easily scaled. But Leszek and his predecessors had initiated a massive program of fortification. They encouraged the growth of cities, but with a caveat: those cities had to be defensible. By 1287, the major centers of power, Krakow, Sandomierz, and the monasteries of the region, were no longer protected by timber. They were encased in high, thick stone walls, flanked by towers, and stocked with provisions. This shift from wood to stone was the first nasty surprise for Tulebuga's northern army. The Mongols were masters of siege warfare when they had the time and the Chinese engineers to build great machines. But this was a raid, intended to be fast and fluid. They carried light equipment. They relied on terror and starvation to force capitulations. When Tulebuga's forces arrived at Sandomierz, they found the gates shut tight. In 1259, the residents of Sandomierz had surrendered in exchange for a promise of safety, only to be slaughtered to a man once they exited the city. The memory of that betrayal was burned into the collective consciousness of the defenders. This time, there would be no parley. The Polish garrison, reinforced by local knights and townsfolk, manned the stone ramparts. The Mongols attempted to storm the city. They rode up to the walls, loosing clouds of arrows to suppress the defenders, hoping to rush the gates with battering rams. But the stone walls of Sandomierz were high, and from those walls rained a deadly counterfire. The Poles had adopted the heavy crossbow, a weapon that lacked the rate of fire of the Mongol bow, but possessed armor-shattering power and range when fired from an elevated position. The Mongol assaults were repulsed, time and again. The horsemen, so lethal in the open, were useless against vertical stone. They could only circle the city, frustrated, freezing in the Polish winter, while the defender sat secure behind their fortifications. Realizing that Sandomierz would not fall easily, Tulebuga did what Mongols usually did. He detached forces to ravage the surrounding countryside, hoping to draw the defenders out. But here, too, he met frustration. The scorched earth policy implemented by Leszek the Black meant that the peasantry had largely retreated into the fortified citadels or deep into the dense forests, taking their livestock and grain with them. The easy plunder was gone. The easy food was gone. While Tulebuga gnashed his teeth outside Sandomierz, the southern pincer under Nogai Khan was advancing on the capital, Krakow. Nogai was the more dangerous of the two commanders, experienced, patient, and ruthless. He arrived at Krakow expecting the city to tremble. But Krakow, too, had been transformed. The Wawel Castle, the seat of the High Duke, had been heavily fortified with stone. The city proper was surrounded by new defensive rings. The siege of Krakow in 1287 became a legendary standoff. Nogai launched a fierce assault on the city gates. The fighting was brutal and close quarters, but the Polish knights, fighting on foot alongside the burghers, held the line. There is a distinct shift in the narrative here compared to 1241. In the past, the breakdown of command was the prelude to slaughter. Here, the discipline held. The defenders knew that the Mongols were not demons, they were flesh and blood, and they bled just like anyone else when struck by a bolt or a sword. The failure to take Krakow quickly was a disaster for Nogai's strategy. A Mongol army is a hungry beast. 30,000 men and perhaps 3 times as many horses require an enormous amount of food every single day. In the dead of winter, with the granaries inside the stone walls and the fields buried under snow, the supply situation for the invaders began to deteriorate rapidly. The besiegers were becoming the besieged, trapped by the weather and their own logistical needs. It was at this moment that High Duke Leszek the Black made his most decisive move. He did not stay holed up in Wawel. He slipped out of the city to organize a relief force. This was a gamble of the highest order. If he were caught, the resistance would collapse. But Leszek traveled to Hungary to seek aid from King Ladislaus IV. The alliance between Poland and Hungary was strong, forged by the shared threat of the steppe. While Leszek was rallying support, the Polish forces remaining in the field began to operate with a new level of aggression. They did not form large armies to meet the Mongols in a pitched battle. Instead, they engaged in what we would today call asymmetric warfare. Small bands of heavy cavalry, knowing the terrain intimately, began to ambush Mongol foraging parties. They would strike hard and fast, then retreat back to the safety of the forests or castles. The turning point of the northern campaign came near the Holy Cross Mountains. A Polish force, led by the local nobility who had refused to cower, caught a significant detachment of Tulabuga's army near the town of Lago. The details are sparse in the chronicles, but the outcome was clear. The Poles achieved a tactical victory. They surprised the Mongols, likely trapping them in terrain where their horses could not maneuver, perhaps a narrow valley or deep snowdrifts. For the first time in living memory, a Polish force had met the Mongols in the field and driven them off. This victory at Lagao was electric. It shattered the aura of invincibility. News traveled fast. The Mongols could be beaten. They were cold, they were hungry, and they were dying. Tulabuga, realizing his campaign was failing, decided to cut his losses. His retreat was not an orderly withdrawal, it was a march of misery. His army, lacking provisions, began to starve. The discipline of the Golden Horde fractured. It is said that Tulabuga's soldiers were reduced to eating their own horses and even their leather armor. As they retreated, they were harried by local partisans, turning the predator into prey. Meanwhile, in the south, the situation for Nogai Khan was about to become catastrophic. Leszek the Black had succeeded. He returned from Hungary not with empty promises, but with a massive relief force of Hungarian heavy cavalry and Cumans, warriors who fought in a style similar to the Mongols and understood their tactics. Nogai, realizing that Krakow was impregnable and hearing rumors of the approaching Hungarian army, lifted the siege. He moved south, towards the Podhale region, perhaps looking for an easier route through the mountains or hoping to plunder the smaller towns before leaving. He targeted the fortified town of Stary Saks. The Battle of Stary Saks is the climax of this dramatic reversal. The town was well defended, its garrison led by a fierce local Castellan. Nogai's forces surrounded the town and prepared to grind it down, but they had run out of time. The Hungarian-Polish relief force, moving with desperate speed through the winter passes, fell upon the Mongol rear. For the Mongols, this was the nightmare scenario. They were caught between the hammer and the anvil, the stone walls of Stary Sats in front of them and the heavy cavalry of Hungary and Poland behind them. The engagement was furious. The Hungarians and Poles, fueled by years of vengeance, smashed into the Mongol lines. The mobility that was the hallmark of the steppe warriors was negated by the surprise and the encirclement. Nogai Khan, a veteran survivor, saw the writing on the wall. He did not stay to die. He ordered a retreat, abandoning much of his loot and the slower elements of his army. The retreat through the Carpathian Mountains was a death march. The winter, which had initially allowed them to cross the rivers, now turned against them with vengeance. Deep snows blocked the passes. The local Highlanders, men who knew every crag and ravine, ambushed the stragglers. The aftermath of the 1288 invasion was a revelation for Europe. The Golden Horde, the superpower that had brought principalities from Kiev to Baghdad to their knees, had been decisively repelled. They had not just failed to take the major cities, they had suffered significant casualties and a humiliating strategic defeat. The rivalry between Tulabuga and Nogai exploded into open hostility following the disaster. Tulabuga, who had suffered the worst of the privation and lost a significant portion of his army to hunger and Polish ambushes, blamed Nogai for lack of support. This internal discord weakened the Golden Horde further, eventually leading to a coup that saw Tulabuga deposed and killed, with Nogai playing the role of kingmaker once again. The failure in Poland had destabilized the very heart of the Mongol leadership. For Poland, the victory was transformative. It validated the painful reforms of the previous decades. The investment in stone fortifications, the modernization of the military, and the strengthening of alliances had paid off. The psychological shackles were broken. The Mongols were still dangerous, and they would raid again in the future, but the existential fear was gone. The Poles now knew that the Devil's Horsemen were mortal. The significance of this victory extends beyond military tactics. It marked the beginning of the end for the Mongol dominance in Central Europe. It showed that the West had adapted. The static feudal systems were evolving. The knights were learning to coordinate with infantry and crossbowmen. The rulers were learning the value of strategic depth and logistics. When we look back at the invasion of 1288, we see a clash of two worlds. On one side, the nomadic war machine relying on speed, terror, and the open steppe. On the other, a sedentary society that had hardened its shell, learned to use the terrain, and discovered the power of stone walls and heavy crossbows. The Mongols didn't expect the walls to be so high. They didn't expect the gates to remain shut. They didn't expect the Polish Duke to strike back. Most of all, they didn't expect that the fear they cultivated so carefully would be replaced by a grim, cold determination. The Battle of Stary Sachs and the defense of Krakow stand as testaments to human resilience. It is a story that reminds us that no empire is invincible forever, and that even in the face of overwhelming odds, adaptation and unity can turn the tide of history. The winter of 1288 was cold, bitter, and long, but as the snow melted and the remnants of the Golden Horde disappeared back into the east, the people of Poland looked out from their stone towers and saw something they hadn't seen in 50 years, a horizon free of smoke and a future that belonged to them. The terror had passed. The dragon had been wounded, and it would think twice before coming back to the land of stone castles. This evolution in warfare, this pivot from vulnerability to impregnability, set the stage for the rise of the Polish kingdom as a major regional power in the centuries to come. It was the crucible in which a new national confidence was forged. The Mongols came to harvest a kingdom of sheep, but they found themselves in a den of wolves, and that, ultimately, is why the invasion of 1288 remains one of the most pivotal, yet underappreciated, turning points in medieval European history. To truly grasp the magnitude of this shift, we must look closer at the tactical nuances that define the engagements. The Mongol composite B-Ow, a marvel of engineering made of horn, wood, and sinew, had an effective range of over 300 meters. In 1241, this range allowed them to dictate the terms of engagement. They could harass the slow-moving European heavy cavalry from a distance, killing horses and wounding knights through the gaps in their mail, without ever coming into contact with the lance or sword. The Europeans, frustrated and bleeding, would break formation to chase their tormentors, only to be surrounded and destroyed. By 1288, the Polish response to this was multifaceted. First, the armor had improved. The transition from mail hauberks to early forms of plate reinforcement had begun. Great helms offered better protection against arrows. But more importantly, the Poles stopped playing the Mongols' game. By staying behind stone walls or fighting in dense terrain where the Mongol cavalry could not fan out, they neutralized the range advantage. Inside the castles, the Polish crossbowmen turned the tables. A heavy crossbow bolt, fired from a winch-drawn mechanism, hit with the force of a sledgehammer. It could punch through the lamellar armor of the Mongol heavy cavalry as if it were paper. In the sieges of Sandomierz and Krakow, the Mongols found themselves under a hail of these bolts, suffering grievous losses without being able to effectively retaliate. Furthermore, the strategic patience displayed by Leszek the Black cannot be overstated. In feudal warfare, honor often dictated action. To sit behind walls while the enemy ravaged your lands was seen as cowardly by some. It took immense political will for Leszek to enforce the strategy of active defense, holding the cities while using small mobile units to cut supply lines. He understood that the Mongols were on a timer. Every day they spent in Poland was a day they consumed resources they could not replace. He weaponized winter. He weaponized hunger. The role of the peasantry also deserves recognition. In 1241, the peasants were victims, slaughtered in the thousands as they fled. In 1288, they were active participants in the defense. They were the ones who cleared the fields of grain before the Mongols arrived. They were the ones who ambushed Mongol scouting parties in the deep forests. The invasion united the social strata of Poland in a way few events had before. It was a total defense of the realm. We must also consider the geopolitical brilliance of the Hungarian alliance. The relationship between Poland and Hungary was often complicated, filled with dynastic squabbles. But in the face of the Golden Horde, they recognized a shared destiny. The speed with which King Ladislaus IV mobilized his forces suggests a pre-existing contingency plan. The Hungarian army that arrived at Stary Sachs was not a ragtag relief force, it was a professional army, hardened by its own struggles against the steppe peoples. The integration of Cuman auxiliaries, nomads who had settled in Hungary, gave the coalition force the ability to scout and skirmish with the Mongols on equal terms. When Nogai Khan looked at the battlefield at Stary Sats, he didn't just see an enemy army. He saw a mirror. He saw heavy cavalry that could match his own shock troops and light cavalry that could match his maneuvers. He saw a Europe that was no longer technologically or tactically inferior. The realization must have been chilling. The easy war was over. The retreat of the Golden Horde was a humanitarian disaster for their army. As they fled back towards the chaotic lands of Ruthenia and the steppe, the cohesion of the Great Horde dissolved. Chronicles describe the route of their retreat as being marked by the frozen bodies of men and horses. The locals, emboldened by the victory, showed no mercy. This was not just a defeat, it was a humilia that echoed through the yurts of the Sarai, the Mongol capital on the Volga. The failure of 1288 also had a profound impact on the Golden Horde's projection of power. While they remained a formidable threat for another 2 centuries, they never again attempted a full-scale conquest of Poland with the intent of permanent subjugation or total destruction. Their subsequent raids were smaller, faster, and more cautious. The border of the Mongol world had been drawn, and it was drawn in stone along the Vistula. For historians, the Third Mongol invasion is a fascinating case study in adaptation. It challenges the popular narrative that the Mongols were unstoppable until they essentially defeated themselves through internal infighting. In Poland, in 1288, they were stopped by superior strategy, better fortifications, and a society that refused to break. It proves that military innovation is often born of trauma. The horrors of Legnica in 1241 gave birth to the victories of Stary Saks in 1288. As the narrative of medieval Europe is often dominated by the Crusades in the Holy Land or the wars between England and France, the titanic struggle on the eastern frontier is frequently overlooked. Yet, it was here, on the snowy fields of Lesser Poland, that the fate of Central Europe was decided. Had the Mongols succeeded in 1288, had they sacked Krakow and Sandomierz again, the development of the region would have been set back by another century. The Polish state might have fragmented entirely. The Renaissance, which would later find a vibrant home in Krakow, might never have flourished there. Instead, the victory galvanized the Piast dynasty. It set the stage for the reunification of Poland in the early 14th century under Władysław the Elbow High, a relative of Leszek the Black. The confidence gained from defeating the Mongols seeped into the national consciousness, fostering a sense of resilience that would define Polish history for generations. So, when we ask what the Mongols didn't expect, the answer is everything. They didn't expect the stone. They didn't expect the crossbows. They didn't expect the unity. But most of all, they didn't expect that the fear they relied upon as their primary weapon had evaporated. They came to conquer a land of ghosts, haunted by the memories of the past, but found instead a land of iron and stone, looking firmly towards the future. The battle that made the Mongols fear Poland was not just a clash of arms, it was a triumph of the human spirit over the paralysis of terror. And in the silence of the retreat, as the Golden Horde vanished into the white void of the East, a new chapter of European history began, one where the steppe no longer dictated the fate of the West.